give you what is on my heart today. Amos is where we're going to go, chapter 9. I hope you, if you're a visitor, you feel welcome. I hope you feel the presence of your Father and know that wherever your daddy is, you are home. I encourage you to reach for God today. I encourage you to stretch for God. I encourage you to get what you came for. If you're going to get out of bed, you need to get what you came for. Don't let anybody or anything stop you. Just look at somebody, tell them, go after it, go after it. I preached last Sunday, go after the river. Let's just go, let's go after it. Everything you need is in the flow of God's river. I want to read Amos 9 and 11. Amos 9, some of y'all still looking for Amos. I'll give you a second. Amos 9, verse 11. It says, and on that day, I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and I will repair its damages, and I will raise it up. I will raise up its ruins. So he's saying to us, on that day, I will do this. I'm God. I'm going to raise up the tabernacle of David. It was up, but it fell. And there's been some damage. But I will help. I will repair the damages. I will get involved in this one. I will personally raise up its ruins and rebuild. I love this, all of this, because it's God is basically saying, I don't need to go out and get new material. What other people have discarded and said there's nothing that good that could ever come out of that. He said, watch and see, watch and see. Because I will repair it, but it's been so damaged. I will repair its damages, and I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old. I will do this, God says. Why is God willing to do that? Look at your neighbor on the right and say, neighbor, because there's no place like home. Turn to your other neighbor and say, neighbor, there's no place like home. Bless your word today, Father. We thank you for it. In the name of Jesus, we give you honor. We pray amen and amen. You may be seated today in the presence of the Lord. If you will tell your neighbor on your way down, there is no place like home. No place like home. About a year or a little more ago, I flew into the city of Detroit, and I don't do this every time I go. Very rarely do I do this, but I got a friend, and we went riding around into, my mama would say, my old stomping grounds. And I had my friend take me by the school that I went to, and had her take me by the old bakery that we used to go to, where you could buy a loaf of bread for 50 cents and watch them slice it right there in front of you. We went by the old house that I lived in, the childhood home. And I was really amazed at how many memories started coming back as I began to look at where I grew up and the house I lived in. I lived in that house for 18 years. And so I actually lived there longer than any place I've ever lived. And it actually brought back just a rush of memories. I remember as I looked at the house, like if you walked up on the stairs, because we had a porch, and if you walked up on the stairs on the right-hand side, there was this one little section, there was a rose bush. And one day, I remember riding my bike along the little sidewalk, and my bike tipping over into the rose bush. So here I was in the briars, when you're caught up in briars, you don't know to move, you don't know not to move, but you do know that the wrong move in the wrong way can cause a whole lot of pain. And so that particular day, I remember just the pain of being caught up in the rose bush itself. I also remember laying up in the bed at night. My bed was up against the window. And I remember looking out many a night on Christmas Eve, and I could see the whole neighborhood was covered with snow. Waking up on Christmas morning to find out that there was even more snow when I woke up than there was when I went to sleep at night. It was just, snow was everywhere. Anybody from the north, Chicago, New York, you know, all of those, yeah. I know all y'all from Chicago, because every time I go out there in that foyer and hug somebody, somebody says, I'm here from Chicago. So I know you know what I'm talking about when I say snow. It's so funny here, because if we get just the slightest forecast that there could be a 1% chance of some kind of something, we go crazy and buy the store out. And I remember us in Detroit, like they would have to plow the streets, and it could be 15 inches of snow. It didn't matter if it was a Sunday morning, we were still going to church. That was just ridiculous. We were going to church. And so I just remember all of those wonderful memories. I also remember that my father and I would get up very early. My mama had to get up 4:30 every morning and go to work. She worked at the A&P bakery, and she would get up and go to work. And when my dad was home, they would wake me up and we would take her to work. And I always would ride into work with her. And I remember that when we would get back to the house, it was still dark outside, and I would run up the stairs. I would beat my dad up the stairs, and I would get in between the storm door, between the what do you call that door? The screen door and the real door, and I would climb up back into this little cubby hole, and I would be like, oh, this is the safest place in the world. I'm in this inner city Detroit, stuck back up in this cubby hole, but I know my dad is just a couple steps behind me. And so I would just get in that little tight spot, and I just remember the peace and the relaxation that would come over me, because, I don't know, there was no place like home to me. I remember how that I would stay in there until he would put his key in the door and unlock the door. And at that point, I'd walk into the house and fall quickly back to sleep. I remember playing up and down the streets of the city of Detroit. I had several friends, and we played all day long, especially in the summer. And I remember I could stay out until the street lights came on. And when the street lights came on, I was like, that's my time. I got to go home. Because if I didn't go home, I could hear my mom hollering all the way down the street, Sheryl. That was my clue. She was calling me out of the darkness, and it was time for me to come home. I remember my first day of school. I remember her taking me shopping and buying me several little outfits to wear to school, and she'd hang them up on the door. And I remember trying to determine which one I was going to wear on my first day of school. Mom was at work, but my sister Elaine was there, and she walked me to school on my very first day. I also remember that at lunchtime, my father, he worked the afternoon shift, so he was home during my lunchtime. He knew when I would be home for lunch, and he would run up to the Tasty Freeze and buy me a hamburger and French fries and a drink, and he'd have it sitting on the table when I got home for my lunch break. He had went ahead and did the work, so I didn't have to waste the time just standing in line somewhere. I remember those wonderful things. I remember a particular Christmas where it was my job to get under the tree and get everybody's presents out. And I remember on that particular Christmas how that the Christmas tree, I brought the house down. I brought the tree down. Everything came falling down. And I was stuck up under the tree. I don't know what it was about that house that always got me in a tight place. But after everybody got through laughing at me, they helped me set the tree back up and helped me get out from there. And then I was able to enjoy the rest of Christmas. It's those little things like that. I remember one particular Christmas, I could not figure out for nothing what my mom got me. And I remember picking up the box, shaking it as hard as I could, and then I just, well, I'll never figure this out. I laid it down, thought, well, I'll just wait till Christmas morning. And when I laid it down, it said, Mama. So I knew I had a doll for Christmas. I remember what it was like. We didn't have air conditioning, forget that. We had box fans, and we also had a big fan in the window. You know what I mean? Anybody ever had a big old fan in the window? And Mama would turn that fan on when we go to bed at night, and we'd lay up in the bed, and I'd sleep at the foot of the bed because that's where the window was, and it was awesome for that wind to just come blowing in the house, and you'd lay there, and you could hear the train, and you could feel the wind blowing, and I don't know, it just was like a little bit of heaven on earth. I remember laying in that bed, feeling that breeze, thinking that there was no place like home. I also remember waking up on Saturday mornings and in certain seasons, and my mom, I knew my mom was busy working. She never slept in, but I could smell what's that, Murphy's oil soap. We had wooden floors, and we had wooden what do you call them? Mama always called them slosh boards. I don't know what they were. Whatever, base, yeah, that's what we had. And man, she had that. I went to bed, and I'm like, this house wasn't messed up, but now it's totally turned upside down. What is happening? She said, I'm spring cleaning. And when you started spring cleaning, it made the house look so much worse before it ever started looking better, because there was stuff that had been hidden through the winter season that when the spring was coming, you had to deal with it, and that's what Mama would do. She would spring clean. I remember also waking up on some Saturdays, and she'd have the ironing board and all of our week's ironing laying out there, and she would just be ironing away. I loved to watch her iron my dad's hankies, because she would iron his hanky, she'd have it laying out, then she'd fold it one way and iron it. Then she'd fold it another way, and she'd iron it again. And then she'd fold it another way, and she'd iron it again, because she didn't want my dad to not have a hanky should he decide he was going to go to church. So she ironed all of the hankies. I also remember we went to a church where we had church on not just Sunday morning, but we also had Sunday night church. Anybody know what that's about? So, but I loved it because I didn't do anything all week long, and so I loved it. I couldn't wait. I'd come home from church on Sunday morning, play church in between church, and then I'd get it back into the car and go back to church for Sunday night. And it was just incredible. On our way home from church, my mama would pull into the White Castle. Y'all don't know nothing about no White Castle? Woo! And it ain't the same. I don't care. You can go to Kroger and buy them frozen all day long, but it ain't the same. And we would always grab something to eat, and we'd come home and then go to sleep, and then our week would start the next morning. But one particular Sunday, I took a nap, which I never really took too many naps, but on Sunday afternoon, I went home and fell asleep. And I woke up, and it was late, and my mama was already gone to church. My dad was there, but my mama had left me home with my dad. I was so upset, and it hurt my feelings so bad that I went over from being upset and hurt feelings into mad. How dare would she leave me at home while she went to church on a Sunday night? Because that Sunday night was the best church, because everybody that was there wanted to be there. And I mean, we could just really just have good church. But I was a kid, so she didn't want to wake me up, left me at home. And I remember I was so mad, I didn't know I was going to get her for that. And all I can remember do is finding blank sheets of paper. And I remember taking those blank sheets of paper, and I got a pair of scissors, and I cut those blank sheets of paper up into a gazillion pieces, like just pieces, all kinds of pieces. And I threw paper all over the house, everywhere I could. That was the meanest thing I could think of doing. I mean, kids have a much bigger imagination today. Hello, and they could set the house on fire, and usually it ain't because you didn't take them to church, but for whatever reason. But I was mad. I was mad because she didn't take me to church, and that was because my mama loved a clean house, and so that was like the worst thing I could do. So I did that, and it was just it was home. Those were all of these memories. I'm sitting there in a car that and just looking at the house, thinking about all of my memories. I remember walking to the store that was just up the street. It was the penny candy store. And you could walk up there and get Mary Jane's or Black Jack's or any of that old candy, and you could get it for a penny. And I remember that was fun. I also remember being sick a few times in that house. I was just so sick and burning up with a fever or just very sick. And I remember my parents, they would watch over me, just watch over me like I was a national treasure. They would watch over me to make sure that my fever didn't get too high. I remember also playing church in the house, and we had a staircase, and the staircase was my pews. And I had an elevated seating sanctuary before anybody else did. And I had imaginary church members, and they were always so easy to get along with. Boy, let me tell you something. The real world hit me hard. But I just remember us playing church on those stairs, which was my pews. I remember sliding down the banister and Mama yelling, "Get off of that banister, you're gonna get hurt." I remember playing dolls in that house. I remember playing with Barbie dolls. I remember when my sister came to visit, and she had a Saint Bernard, and the dog's name was Duchess. If you ever seen a Saint Bernard, you know they are very slobbery. And Mama wouldn't let the dog come in the house, but she did keep it out in the backyard. And my little niece went out there, and she had a sucker, and she decided she wanted to share her sucker with Duchess. And so she would take a lick, and she'd give it to Duchess, and Duchess would take a lick. And I was quite appalled, but, you know, I was a kid too, so I just thought, well, I'm never sharing my sucker with Duchess. I'll tell you that right now. I remember in that house, I remember birthday parties. I remember graduating from the Bennett Elementary School, going to Wilson. We called it junior high back then. I remember that. I remember getting my first job, which was about a block away, and I would walk up there to that place. It was a little cafeteria. It was my job at 6 a.m. to make coffee and to make sure it was ready for the guests. I remember learning to drive in that house. I also remember learning how to parallel park because we did not have a garage. We did not have a carport. You had to parallel park. And so I had to pass that when I went to get my driver's license. I remember my boyfriend coming to see me. And I remember he drove this little Pinto, and it had a stick shift. And I remember that he would there was a little bar that was on the corner, and it actually literally did a curve around that bar, and he was crazy at the time, and he loved to get around, just get right in the middle of that curve and yank up the emergency brakes, and the tires would squeal, and everybody would come running out of the bar like, "What has happened?" And then he would hit the gas and just take off. I thought that was funny. I remember my fiance coming to that house, and I remember those days. I remember my wedding day when Mama said, "Let me just take that dress out in the alley," because we had alley. "Let me take that dress out in the alley and set it on fire. And if you'll let me do that, I'll buy you a brand new car. If you'll give him up for your car, I'll go buy it today." She just didn't want to lose me. It's not that she didn't want him to be a part of our family. She just felt like she was going to lose me. And so, and I'm going to tell you something. Right now, if my mom was here, she would jump up and say, "Thank the Lord you did the best thing when you decided to do that." That house had all of those memories to me. I remember bringing my babies home from the hospital over to Mama's house for the very first time. I love that house, and the reason I love that house is because it was where I grew up. It was paradise to me. It was holy ground to me. It was sacred ground. It was absolutely one of my most favorite houses. And it was one of my most favorite houses because it was there that so many of my powerful memories were made. I took a picture of it that day, and I gave it to our team last night. I said, "Could y'all put the house up when I call for it?" And there's the house. Now, it didn't look quite that bad when I lived in it. But that was home. And it was my As I think about it, it was my favorite house. Obviously, you could not love that place like I love that place because you didn't make the memories there that I made there. And I could tell you some stories. I've just spent 10, 15 minutes talking about them. I could tell you some stories about that house on Senator Street in Detroit. But once I told them, there would be so much more than stories because they were actually snapshots of my life locked into memories. And it was the memories that I made while living in my favorite house. When I saw the shape that house was in that day, I wanted to buy it. I wanted to restore it. I wanted to rebuild it, all for the sake of the memories. All just for the sake of the memories. I thought it was big back then. When Mama said we got a clean house, I'm like, Lord, this is gonna be all day. And now I look at it and it looks just like a little cracker box. I don't know, it's little. But I loved it because it was of the memories. In the book of Amos, chapter 9, where we read today, after this I will return and I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down. And I will rebuild its ruins and I will set it up. What is it? And what was it about David's house? What was it about the tabernacle of David that would make God commit and say, I want to rebuild it? Why would he not rebuild Moses' tabernacle? Because that was the first heavenly dwelling place that had been made by earthly hands. You would think that God would say, I'm going to rebuild Moses' tabernacle. Or better yet, why not? Why would he not say, I'm going to rebuild Solomon's temple? Because Solomon's temple was something to behold. Why David's house? And I think the answer to that is because David's house was God's favorite house. Like that house on Senator was my favorite house. David's house was God's favorite house. And I believe that it was like that because God had some experiences in David's tabernacle that happened there that did not happen anywhere else. You see, David's tabernacle was less about structure, but it was more about a shift. It was more about an encounter. It was more about a happening. Church today, unfortunately, is more about structure and less about encounter. And it's less about happenings. This is also what made the house on Senator Street so important to me and so meaningless to others. It was the memories in the house that brought about the difference. And so God is saying to us here in Amos, and then he repeats himself in Acts chapter 15 and verse 16. He is saying, if I can get the passion of David's heart restored, then I will personally assist you in rebuilding David's house. I'll assist you in the rebuilding process. And out of all of the buildings, all of the edifices, all of the structures, all of the tents, all of the temples, all of the tabernacles that had ever been built, God said, I am dedicated to rebuilding David's house. I believe what would make him pick David's house, David's makeshift shelter on Mount Zion. Why would he pick that one to be the one that he would rebuild? And the answer to that, I'm going to give you what I think it is, but let me warn you, because it could threaten your thought patterns, and it could threaten our mind frames, and it could even threaten some of our cherished memories as to what we think that the church is or what we think that the church is supposed to be. But David's makeshift shelter, I mean, he chose to rebuild that one, and it barely even qualified as a tabernacle. When I say barely, I mean it barely qualified. So if you are curious, like I am, as to what God would make God say, I'm going to rebuild that one instead of Moses' tabernacle and instead of Solomon's temple and its multi-million-dollar splendor, then I get that, because I am curious too, because there's no comparison at all to Moses' tabernacle and Solomon's temple and David's tabernacle. David's tabernacle was just it was just like a tarp that was laid over poles that were standing in the ground. And it was just enough to shelter the ark from the sun that was beating down. And God said, that's the one. Yep, that one, that's what I'm talking about. I want to rebuild that place right there, because evidently what is impressive to God and what is impressive to people are not the same thing. Yes, they had so much in Solomon's temple that the queen of Sheba came in and said, here, I'm gonna give money. I want to see how this thing is. I want you to show me it in all of its glory. But God said, that's not what I'm after. And when God said, I am going to return and rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, he is clearly saying, I didn't pull that one down. That one just fell down. It also is an indicator that it was being held up by something that was man-made, because if it had been held up by a sovereign God, it would have never come down, and because God never gets weary in well-doing. He appears to be saying to us here, I know that David's tabernacle was made by man, but I also know that man's hands do get weary from time to time. So I'm going to kick in and I'm going to start a process that will strengthen mankind. And I'm going to lead them back to the same house that David had, because David's house was my absolute favorite house. Tell somebody, there is no place like home. See, I'm not sure that I don't know why we keep forgetting, but God is not into buildings as much as we are into buildings. God is not impressed with the beautiful buildings that we have that are called the church or the sanctuary. It's nice, it's pretty, it's nice to have them, but sometimes our attachment to steeples and our attachment to stained glass windows can get in the way of what real worship is all about. I said our attachment to all of the things that we call church, the music, the sound, the people, the lights, all of those are wonderful. But at the end of the day, if we're not careful, it will get in the way of us from really breaking down and worshiping God. And God would much rather have our passion than he would a palace. I said he would much rather have our passion than he would a palace. And if you think about it, David himself, he was like, this is all I can do right now. But the truth is, I really want to do something better for you. I want to build you a temple. And God said, no. It's okay. It ain't about the temple. What's really important here is about you and me, David. It's what we have together. It's our heart connection. And when Solomon finally does build the temple, God spoke up at the dedication, and he told him, Solomon was David's son. He told him, he said, if you or your sons at all turn from following me, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and his house which I have, and this house which I have, I will cut. I know it's pretty, I know it's beautiful, it's cost millions of dollars, but I will cut that thing down so fast that you will never know that it even existed. I will cast it out of my sight. Israel will be nothing but a proverb and a byword among all of the people. And as for this house which is exalted, everyone who passes by it in its ruins will be astonished, and they will hiss. He said, let me tell you, this is great, but this is not what it's about. And the day that you make it about the house being great and not about you and I having a great relationship, then you have messed up this whole thing. And I will tear it down brick by brick, and everybody that looks at you will know, that was beautiful, but today it is lying in ruins, because God is saying the most important thing is what we got going on, heart to heart, face to face. When Jesus' own disciples was talking about how beautiful Herod's temple was, he opened up his mouth and he prophesied, these things which you see, The days will come in which not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And yet he never said that about David's house. He never said that about David's tabernacle. He actually said the opposite. He said, if this does go down, I'm going to be the one. I commit to helping you. I'm going to bankroll you to get this built back. Why? Why? Because God had memories of wonderful things that happened in David's house. God is saying, can I help you? I want to help you. I want to help you restore this place. I want to get your tent poles standing back up tall again. I want to get this tarp stretched over those poles. Can I restore what the weakness of men have allowed to collapse? Can I restore what time has stolen away from you? He was saying the memories of my encounters with man in that place were important to me. See, we talk about God encounters, but God talks about man encounters. We're asking God, we're saying, God, we just want a God encounter. And God's saying, I just want a man encounter. Because encountering his children, it affects God. It's not that it doesn't affect God. It affects God when he has an encounter with his children. He will rip down veils from the top to the bottom. He'll interrupt time. He'll do whatever he's got to do in order to have an encounter with his kids. Look at your neighbor and say, he loves me. God gets something out of that. Do you understand that God gets something out of our worship? I remember just this week, Nina said, Mom, just meet me at McDonald's. The kids like that playground, so I'm going to go over there for a few minutes and I'm going to let them play. And so when I came in, they were so surprised to see me that they got so excited. They come running out of the playground and they gave me a hug, and then they climbed back in. But the minute they climbed in, they were both saying, Gigi, watch me. Gigi, watch this. Gigi, watch this. And I was going from one to the other. Yeah. Oh, and they would jump, and I would be like, oh, Jesus. You know, I don't know. Something about my kids, they could jump and climb on all those monkey bars. It never fazed me. But now that it's my grandkids, I'm like, oh, what is it about that? I don't know. But I was, Gigi, watch me do this, watch me. And I was just watching and watching, and it meant the world to them that they had my undivided attention. But they're not the only one that walked away from there with an experience. As Gigi, I walked away with an experience too. That said, they wanted my undivided attention. Now, all y'all got grown kids and they don't even care to look at you at all. But if you can just look back, you remember those days that, yeah, I remember then they wanted me to watch me spin, and they wanted me to watch them as they did somersaults, and they wanted me, you know, and we get something out of that as well. That's how God is when it comes to worship. Worship is not just us coming in here and trying to lift our hands so we can feel better, so the burden of our soul can roll away, and we walk out of here feeling like, okay, maybe I can face this week a little better. No, God said, I want to watch you enjoying yourself in my presence, because as I see you enjoying me, it makes me enjoy you all the more. So what was so powerful about David's tabernacle? It was actually, what was really so powerful about David's tabernacle didn't start when David built the tabernacle. It started when David was a shepherd boy who was out on the field in the backside of the desert in the late midnight hour watching his father's sheep, because it was there that he actually laid the foundations of building a relationship with God. It was there that he learned how to communicate with God. It was there. Nobody else was there. So David would talk to God, and God would talk to David, and David would sing, and God would tap his foot, and the two of them were just like peanut butter and jelly. They just went together, and that communication that he learned how to do out on the field came in handy when they crowned him as the king, because David knew, I can't be king without God being king with me, and God is not here. Saul could not care less if the Ark of the Covenant was there there. But David said, I can't be king without God. So what David did was he made up his mind, I'm going after God, and I'm going to get God back in Jerusalem. And it's important that we watch how David went when he went after God. He was going after God in his father's field. He was going after God. He was trying to please God when he was looking at Goliath. He was going after God when he was fighting a lion and fighting a bear. All of those things, the similar thing that they all had in common is David was going after God. He was going after the things of God. And now he's the king, and he's still determined, I am going to still go after God. And what David did on his journey to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to his tabernacle is that David, it's a journey. It's the same journey that we're on today as we attempt to return the presence of God back to his church. See, when David started talking about bringing the ark back into Jerusalem, here's what I love about David. David did not care about the fact that it was covered in gold. That didn't motivate him. He had plenty of gold. He didn't care that it was a box that had been overlaid with gold. He could get a box anywhere. That did not matter. What mattered to David about the whole thing was there was a flame that hovered over the outstretched wings of the cherubims, and they sat on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and that flame that was in the midst of them. See, that flame was a sign that God himself was present. And David said, I got to know that God is present. Do we have a picture of the Ark of the Covenant? If we do, throw it up for me. Y'all holler at me when they get it up. There it is. Okay, so, yeah. Well, y'all see the flame y'all see the glow in the middle? Well, I think they need a little more Jesus. Come on, give me another one. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about right there. It was the mercy seat. And that flame meant that God was present. And wherever God was, that meant there was wherever the flame was, that meant that there was a manifest presence of the glory of God. And wherever God was, victory was. And wherever God was, power was. And wherever God was, the blessings was there too. Because intimacy with God will always bring about the blessing. But pursuing the blessing alone will not always bring about the intimacy that you have with God. So David's passion for God is really meant to teach us something. David pursued God, and God loved it. God loved the fact that David would chase after him. David was the one man in Scripture to which God said, he is a man after mine own heart. Now, some people think that means that David was a man who was like God. Oh, if you see David was like God. But I want to suggest to you that there could be more than one meaning for that phrase. And it could also mean that David was the man who was constantly after God. He was chasing after God. He didn't want to do anything without God. He was a pursuer of God's presence. The very fact that he went after the ark when he became king was proof that he had a passion for the presence of God. Hit your neighbor and say, neighbor, are you a pursuer of God's presence? Or do you wait for it to overtake you? Do you wait for it to knock you down? Do you wait for your favorite song? Do you wait for your favorite? Y'all ain't asking your neighbor. Y'all got quiet. Do you wait for your favorite worship leader? Are you after man or are you after God? Are you a God seeker or a man pleaser? Are you on the hunt? When you come into this church, are you after God? Are you hungry? Are you hunting for the river? Look at somebody and tell them you sat next to a river hunter. I am hungry for the river of God's presence, and I got to be in a church where I can seek after God's glory. So there were similarities between Moses. There were similarities between Moses' tabernacle, David's tabernacle. and the temple of Solomon. As a matter of fact, the tabernacle of Moses and Solomon's temple, they both had three very distinct enclosed areas. One was the outer court, one was the holy place, and one was the Holy of Holies. And there was a heavy veil that draped all throughout, that draped and separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the tabernacle. Moses built he took a wooden box made of acacia wood under the inspiration of God, and he built that box, and he covered it with gold, and he followed the instructions of God, and he put two cherubims, you saw them, he put two cherubims on the box facing each other with their wings spread out, and it was in that space between the tips of their wings that was called the mercy seat. And it's there that the manifest presence of God, it was there that the flame began to manifest, because it was there that God hovered over that spot. And the ark and the flame of God's glory and the mercy seat, they were always hidden behind the veil in Solomon's temple or in Moses' tabernacle. But God never liked that. God hated the fact that there was a veil that separated him from his kids. So when he gave his son to die on the cross and his son hollered, "It is finished," he ripped the veil, not from the bottom up, but he ripped it from the top down. Oh, y'all better hear me. He ripped it from the top. It was in the temple of Herod. He ripped the veil from the top, and he ripped it so severely that it could never be woven back together, because God said, "I never again want to be separated from my kids." He hated that the veil got in between us, because the veil represented the wall, it represented the barrier, it represented separation, it represented a dividing line that separated God from mankind. Until Calvary, God had to be behind the veil to preserve the life of those who were fallen, the fallen humanity that would come to worship him. But David's tabernacle was the only one of all three of the structures that had no veil. Could that be the reason that God said, "David's house is my absolute favorite house"? Because God doesn't like being separated from his own kids. That's why God hates sin, because sin separates us like a veil from the presence of God. So he went he went so far as to rip the veil. Well, he went so far as to rip the flesh of his son. And when his son's flesh was ripped on Calvary and he hollered out, "It is finished," he said, "This is my chance." And he took the veil at the time. It was at the top. Nobody could get to it. It had to be God who did that. And he shredded it, and he said, "At this moment, I will rip this veil, and never again does there have to be space, because I'm tired of having visiting hours with my kids. I want full custody of my kids." Y'all better help me today. I want access to them. I want them to have access to me. I want full custody of my kids. And in David's makeshift little place where he put the ark, there was no veil. There was no wall. There was nothing that separated the flame and the presence of God from the people in David's house. As a matter of fact, the only thing that was encircling God, it was encircling God's presence in David's house were the worshipers who worship God 24/7. All day, every day. Somebody say all day, every day. 24/7. All day, every day, there were worshipers who were encircling the ark. They were encircling the presence of God. And David lived adjacent to where the ark was. And so if David got up in the middle of the night for any reason, he could hear the chanting. He could hear the singing. He could hear the timbrels. He could hear the shuffling of people's feet as they began to dance. He could hear, his quarters was close enough so that he could hear the worship that was taking place. He could see in there, and he could see through the flickering of the lights of candlesticks. He could see people's feet as they shuffled and walked around the presence of God. Oh, Lord have mercy. That blesses me right there. I'm sorry, y'all. And it might have just been at that one of those kind of moments where David picked up his pen in the middle of the night and wrote, bless the Lord, oh my soul. Oh, you servants of the Lord who stand by night in the house of the Lord. Lift your hands in the sanctuary of the holy place and bless ye the Lord. Day and night worshipers stood. Day and night they danced. Day and night they worshiped in the presence of God. It was as if they were holding the windows of heaven open every time they would lift up their hands. Do you understand that when you enter in the presence of God, you might just be holding open the windows of heaven for somebody that doesn't understand how to lift their hands in the holy place? Look at somebody and say, keep your hands up, keep your hands up, keep your hands up, because blessings are coming down through those windows. David's tabernacle was very unique. In every other place of worship where the ark was housed, worshipers had to worship what was behind the veil. They had to worship without ever knowing what was really there. They had to worship without ever seeing what was really there, except for the one day of the year when the priest would go in. But other than that, they had to worship just oh, well, maybe he's there. I'm just going to worship by faith. Maybe he's there. But in David's tabernacle, the glory of God was seen by everybody. It was seen by worshipers. It was seen by heathens. It was seen by people who were just passing by. Everybody could see the glory. There was so much glory and there was no veil that it didn't matter who you were. You could be totally out of your mind and you could walk by, but you couldn't deny that there was a glory that was on the house. And here's why: because unveiled worship creates an unhindered view. So whenever you have unveiled worship, nothing hinders your view from the presence of God himself. And one of the reasons that David's house might have been God's favorite house was because of his desire for God's presence. David's question that was on his heart from day one when he became king was, how can I get the ark back? How can I get it back to where it belongs? Because the ark had been taken captive. And David had this strong desire to be in the presence of God, and he acted on his desire. Let me tell you something. When you have that desire leap up in you to get in the presence of God, tell somebody next to you, act on it, act on it, act on it. Open your mouth, clap your hands, bow, sing, shout, think on the goodness of Jesus. But whatever you do, it does you no good to want it if you're not going to act out and move toward it. So David's first attempt to go get the ark and bring it back where it belonged, you know the story, it ended up in a disaster. That's where the ark tipped and Uzzah, who was David's right-hand man, got killed, and the ark laid in the front yard of Obed-Edom's house. So it was bad for David, but it was good for Obed-Edom. And David, and finally David and his procession of Levites and worshipers, they finally reached Jerusalem. This was the second attempt. And so they finally reached it after a 15-mile journey on foot. They walked 15 miles carrying the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders. And every sixth step, David would stop and say, kill an animal, let the blood fall in the street, and we will offer a sacrifice of praise to God. You imagine how long it would take you to walk 15 miles if you stopped every seventh step? That's what they did. These men walked and they slew animals, and then they keep going, and they'd go a little bit further, and they'd do it again. They'd go this far, and they'd stop and have a praise break, and then they'd get themselves together and go a few more steps and have another praise break. They never, ever thought, oh, come on, I think we can go 12 steps this time. Absolutely not. They did it according to what David told them to do. So when they got in the vicinity of Mount Zion, they absolutely flipped out, because David realized, I'm telling you something, I don't know if it was his crazy praise, and it was a crazy praise because he started coming out of his clothes. It's crazy when you start coming out of your clothes. Don't do that here. Please don't do that. Because everybody ain't able to look at you in all of your glory. Okay? David went crazy and started worshiping God. Probably it was half the fact that he went crazy and started worshiping God was he was just out of relief. Oh, thank God, the end is in sight. It was not so much just out of joy, but it was out of a little bit of relief too. Look at your neighbor, say, neighbor, if you wonder why we worship like we worship in this church, it's because we made it. Whew, we made it. We made it into this church. We made it into this day. We made it into the house of God. We went through a lot, but we finally got here. See, some of y'all don't know what that means, but for those of us that made it, you've had a week from hell, but you realize I made it. I made it. The devil said I wouldn't make it, but I'm here. I'm here. I got my right mind. And Lord, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for being so good. Look at somebody, say, I made it, I made it, I made it. I made it. I was glad when they said unto me, let's go to the house of the Lord. And I made it. David was excited because David had been valuing, listen to me, David had been valuing the things of God. He had been valuing the things that God valued. But his wife was a different story altogether. His wife was Michal, and she valued dignity over deity. I said she valued dignity over deity. So all of that praise going on in that street was just a little too much for her. And I could tell you why, but I don't have time to go through all that route. But I will tell you, she was Saul's daughter. She was the daughter of a rejected order. So she was used to a whole lot less complicated praise, but she was also used to a whole lot less power. Okay. She valued her dignity over God's deity. Ooh. And because of that, there was a curse of barrenness that was placed on her. It also might have been because of the fact that from that day forward, there was no intimacy between her and David. Oh, see, and like Michal, the landscape of the American church is barren. The landscape of America is littered with barren churches because they no longer have time for us to be intimate with God. Oh, so they turned their back on God's power. They turned their back on God's deity and decided they would just go to a place where they could get in and out and keep their dignity. Oh. See, you got to remember that David wasn't just after the gold. He wasn't just after the box. He was interested in the presence of God that was in that box. He didn't even care about the artifacts that were inside of the box, Aaron's rod that budded, and because all of that spoke to somebody else's experience with God. David said, I'm glad for you, Aaron, that your rod budded, but the truth is your experience is not enough for me. I've got to have my own experience. It is nice that you had yours, but I got to have mine. There's no fascination in that for me on a personal level, but what he was after was God's presence. He was after God's glory. He was after that flame of fire because he said, I got to know myself. So David's actions were saying, I've got to learn how to carry the fire myself. I can't wait on Aaron or Aaron's rod. I've got to be able to carry the fire for myself. Listen, church, let me tell you something. We can build the best buildings. We can build the most beautiful parking lots. We can raise up the best singers and the best musicians, and we can double our volunteer base. You could even get a better preacher who preached you better sermons. But if we don't have the flame of God's fire in the middle of us, God is not pleased with us. And sooner or later, he will make sure that a flameless church becomes as unimportant to people as it is to him. No flame equals no fire, and no fire equals no results. It means we've got barren buildings with hollow hearts. The people in it, their hearts are hard and they're hollow because the building is barren, because there is no fire of God's glory. Oh, look at somebody and tell them it's cold in here. Warm up this place with the heat of your worship. Warm up this place with the heat of your worship. Warm up this this church with the heat of your worship. Don't complain about it being cold. Catch on fire. Burn with the Holy Ghost. I gotta go. I'm out of time. But here, let me tell you this. When they finally got the ark back to the Mount Zion, when he finally got it back to Mount Zion, the Levites laid it down in its right place. And wow. And they all turned around and started to walk out. And David said, hey, where you going? Hey, where you going? I need to do that when people start walking out of church. Hey! Where you going? Church ain't over yet. David said, absolutely not. You ain't going nowhere. Sir, excuse me, but we've just walked 15 miles with the ark of God's presence on our shoulders. We were prepared, and we sacrificed thousands of animals along the way. Are we not done yet? Are we not done yet? David said, excuse me, are you kidding me? Are you absolutely kidding me? I did not take us through all of that, trying to restore the Levitical office, only to watch you set it down and abandon it and walk away, just like it was abandoned in Shiloh. We could have just left it in Shiloh. Put your ephod back on. Take your purse and get back to your seat. Pick up your harps. Pick up the psalteries. If you want to go to lunch and you got to eat, go in shifts, but never leave this flame unattended. You go and you go, but the rest of y'all, you stay right here. I'm telling you, you ain't going nowhere. You're staying right here. And they were like, well, what the world? Is it you that wants to hear us play? David, you're the one who wants to hear us? David said, absolutely not. Worship is not about me. Worship is about God. It is not for me that you play. It is not for me that you sing. You do this for God. He said we didn't go through all of this just to have a temporary visitation of God. He said we want a habitation of God. So you guys over here, you take the first shift, 3 hours. And then 3 hours later, you all take that shift. And 3 hours later, I long for the day that we have to keep the church open all night long while worshipers come and holler and scream and give glory to the name of Jesus. David wanted them to understand that worship was 24/7. He also wanted them to cultivate a mindset that said, I am not here for me. I am here for God. And yet there's no way in the world that you can come and honor God. Be here for God. Sing God's praises. Do it with all your heart and him not meet you right here in this holy of holies. Look at somebody, say, who are you here for? Who are you here for? Tell him I'm here for God. I'm here for God. I'm here for him. I'm here for him. He's worth 24/7. He's the Lamb of God. He carried my sins so far away that I don't have to remember it again. He's holy. Yeah, he torn down every veil that tried to get between me and him. He ripped it down. When death got between me and him, he held death at bay and said, no, don't touch that one right there. When I could have lost my mind, he pulled my insanity up and my insanity down. He tore down look at somebody, tell him every veil, every veil, every veil. So not just so that I could be blessed, but so that I could bless him as well. And I'll close with this. It is the understanding. It is understanding the object of your worship that will stop it from becoming mechanical. Anytime your worship becomes mechanical and your mind easily wanders off and you're standing here but you're next week somewhere else down the road anticipating what tomorrow's problems will be, it's a sign that your worship has become mechanical. David's house became God's most favorite house because of the worshiper that lived there. You understand? Just like my house on Senator Street. Y'all could look at it. It was nothing to desire. But it became I've certainly lived in better houses. But it became my favorite house. It became my favorite house because of who lived in that house. My mama lived in that house. My daddy was in that house. My family was in that house. There were people in that house that loved me at the core for who I was. I never had to climb through any hoops to try to find acceptance, to try to find out if they really love me. No. That was my favorite house. And there's no place like home. Because when you find your real home, I realize that many people had a complete different experience than I had. But I still have to tell you mine. Home may mean something completely different to you as a kid, but if you ever really find home base, it's a wonderful thing. And it will become your favorite house because there are no veils. There are no walls that separate God from his kids. God wanted people he could do life with. So that's why he was willing to rebuild David's tabernacle. The tabernacle that was man-made and whose hands got mighty tired trying to hold it up. But God said, I had such a good time there in that house. I wonder what God thinks when he looks into the potter's house. Does he remember? Ooh, you remember that Sunday when I dropped my glory in that place? And then people were running all over the building, getting breakthroughs. You remember that day, Pastor Brady, when my glory failed and the whole church just began to weep? You remember when the glory failed and the whole place started clapping? It was like fire. What does God think about you when he thinks about your car? Riding to work with you? When he thinks about coming to your house? Does he have memories? There was a day that they used to seek me. They looked for me. They followed hard after me. It's like the woman who heard the knock on the door. Oh, it's my beloved. I'm coming. But she took her time because it was no longer special for whatever reason for him to knock. See, the scariest time is not when he's knocking. The scariest time is when you can no longer hear him. Don't wait till then to get up and move. But while he is yet knocking, yes! So by the time she got to the door and she opened it up, all she could do was smell the fragrance of the fact that he had been there. But he's not here anymore. All I've got is the fragrance of his presence. But I don't have him anymore. Let us never, Potter's House North, get to the point that we become okay with just the fragrance of his presence. Just a memory of what life was like in that house. There's got to be something in every last one of us that follows hard after God and learns how to carry the flame. Once you walk out of here, you don't come in here just to see a flame. You come in here to add your flame to this flame. And the next thing you know, the whole place is engulfed in a huge fire because we all brought our flame. We live, we move, and we have our being every day with the flame of God's presence. Stand with me all over the building. There is no place like home, God says. I was at home there. I had access to my kids. My kids had